So on the sightseeing tour, we got brought around and shown a lot of the really beautiful and unique parts of the city of Kiev. We saw a lot of the things that had a lot of historical significance, like the St. Sophia Cathedral. We saw a lot of historical monuments, places where we're able to see how a lot of the different cultures and a lot of the different time periods had influenced the city of Kiev and their architecture and just the way it's structured. We also got to see some of the most beautiful parts of the city, like there were some murals that were painted. We were able to see Sikorsky's house, and he was the person that first invented the first prototype of the helicopter. So it was really interesting to see a lot of the historical significance of the city of Kiev. And then we were also able to point out some of the things that we had seen later on in our trip, like the St. Sophia Cathedral and the World War II Museum and stuff like that. Later on in the day, we were able to go on a boat tour, and that was a really nice way to finish our trip in Kiev, because we were able to see all the stuff that we had seen before, but obviously from the water. So it was a great way to see the beauty of the city and to have a little fun as well.
So we went to Yanukovych's mansion, the former president of Ukraine. It's a symbol of the immense oppression and the high levels. It shows the corruption that existed and still exists to this day in Ukraine. And through driving around the countryside, we were able to compare the houses and homes of people, of normal people in Ukraine, to this opulent mansion that we saw that was Yanukovych's. It was crazy to see that he had his own 9-hole golf course and all these cars. He had a petting zoo. He had all sorts of things, and it was difficult to walk around the whole place. It was so huge. It was a very surreal experience to see how corruption has played out in Ukrainian politics, and we hope that that will change in the future.
So we drove into the city, and it was a huge incline going up to the monastery. And so the bus pulls up, and so we walk out, and we're just going up this really steep hill. But once we got to the top, you could see kind of the tops of the church that was connected to the monastery. Is a beautiful green and gold domes over there. And then Valentin was our tour guide, and he took us into the monasteries, which was unlike anything I'd ever been in before, because the monasteries were underground caves, and so they were very small. You kind of had to, I'm 5'6", and if I was any taller, I would have had to been ducking the whole time, basically. And you go into it, it's very narrow, but there were a lot of other people in there, like pilgrims and other people visiting. We were the tourists, but there were people there to visit the relics of the saints that they had in the monastery, which was just phenomenal. And a lot of the saints, their bodies had been preserved, and so most of them were covered with ornate materials. But at one point there was a body that had a hand that had been laid out, and it was, it's a dead person, but it was the hand was there. You could tell that it was, a human hand, it kind of blew my mind. But it was just only candlelit down there, and it was just a very unique experience visiting those underground monasteries. Kiev was a beautiful city, I thought, and one of the girls on this trip, Haley, she described it as accidentally beautiful, which I think fits it perfectly, because it's not super... There's no one thing that's particularly eye-catching when you go into Independence Square. I mean, there are some monuments there, but it's just like the little things that you notice, like on buildings, they have faces carved into the sides of them, or they have flowers carved into the sides, and if you walk down the side streets, there's no real quiet place in Kiev. It's all bustling, even the small tiny streets, and you can just walk into shops in there. But Independence Square was definitely one of my favorite parts of it, and the churches are just immensely gorgeous, and there's a lot of beautiful things to do and see in Kiev.
So we got to learn a lot about the religion and politics of Ukraine, which was really interesting. I think something that was very interesting to learn about political-wise in Ukraine was how they recently had an election and how there was so much corruption in Ukraine with the oligarchs that are present and how they elect their presidents. And so Zelensky being recently elected, we got to talk to our tour guides and various locals who had interesting opinions on it. And there was a lot of varying opinions on it too. I think, it's not as common in the US to have an election be so one-sided towards a person, which I thought was really cool. And some people, might be more against his ideas, but I'm very optimistic for the future of Ukraine, as well as I think most people. So as far as religion goes in Ukraine, we got to see a few monasteries. It was cool to see how people practice religion in Ukraine. It was very politicized, and I think generally it's more traditional than how most people practice religion in America. And they had a lot of maybe more strict fundamental religious practices that they do. So it's very interesting to learn about that as well.
Okay, so I'm talking about the radar station. So it was actually like a Soviet Union secret town actually inside of Chernobyl town. And the way they would get spies or know if there were spies out there was they'd number their post offices and schools. So for instance, their school was number 3, and if someone was up to ever come and look for school number 3, they would know that they were a spy because that school doesn't exist. But for the radio station itself, it was this big, massive grid that rose at least 100 feet tall. And the cool thing about it was that it was supposed to go all the way around the world and be able to track people from all the way around the world. But I guess I would say it was an A for effort because it didn't really help out at all and didn't really end up working. So I would say it was more of like an A for effort because it was so well hidden. When we were driving up to it, we had to be pointed out by the guides, and I honestly still didn't see it because the tree line was so high and the radar was hidden because of that. But it didn't work at all, and it turned out as soon as the tragedy of Chernobyl happened, they had to evacuate anyways. So it was a big waste of money for the SSR, but the thought behind it was really good, and the way they planned it out, I think, was really cool.
On our first Tuesday in Ukraine, we went to Chernobyl and got to tour everything there. And one of the stops we made was at the Chernobyl power plant. And so it was really cool to get to see kind of where the accident actually happened. When we went there, I wasn't expecting there to be actual people there, kind of just like a nuclear waste land. But there's actually a lot of people there working, cleaning up the site, and then doing a lot of stuff with the spent nuclear fuel. It was really cool to get to see kind of reactor number 4 where it happened, and the big iron dome that was over it, and kind of learn more about how they cleaned it up and just kind of the brave things that all the former Ukrainian people did to help keep everyone safe, even though it didn't end so well for some of them. But it was a really cool experience to get to see that. I didn't really know what to expect, but I was blown away by just Chernobyl in general. So.
So I thought Pripyat was interesting because it was essentially a town or a city near Chernobyl that was lost in time and frozen in time. The people of Pripyat had to leave so quickly after the power plant exploded there that their belongings and their lives were essentially left in this city. And so going there and seeing after almost 30 years that this town essentially remains the same, minus nature coming back to kind of overtake some of the buildings. Seeing how a lot of stuff didn't change and a lot of their lives were essentially uprooted and left there is very interesting and eye-opening for me. So something that really impressed me was just seeing how similar the town of Pripyat was to a lot of like cities that we have in the United States. So Pripyat was kind of the model town for the Soviet Union at the end of the 80s. And so a lot of things that weren't necessarily in other cities in the Soviet Union, this town of Pripyat had. They had like convenience stores where you could pay with your own money to buy things, which didn't always necessarily happen in the Soviet Union. And so seeing how similar it was and how kind of advanced the town was very interesting and really impressed me.
Our whole group visited the World War II Museum while we were in Ukraine, and it was something really cool about the museum. It was the first time I personally have been to a World War II museum, and I thought it was really cool, the layout itself, not like even disregarding the information in the museum. The layout of the whole a building was just incredible, how it leads you from the beginning of the war, and then when you leave the like exhibits, you go to the top and it goes to present day. It was just really cool how it was laid out. And what the lady was talking about, she basically went throughout the history of World War II, starting with the Nazis and then going towards the Soviet Union side, and then going to the how the Holocaust affected Ukraine. And then at the very end, she talked about essentially the men who were lost in the battle. And that was one of the coolest exhibits I saw. It was just a hallway of pictures and portraits of the men who were killed in the war, and then their wives on the other side of the hallway staring essentially at their dead husbands' pictures. And it was something that really, you gotta take to heart, because those men and women, they put so much effort and heart into the war, and it's something that will always stick with them forever in Ukraine. So it's kind of something interesting that I also learned about the museum. I mean, it's really interesting learning about the Soviets, the symbol, sickle and hammer, in a good perspective, because in the beginning of the war, they were the Allies essentially, and that was something that the museum displayed, which I never really thought about looking into that.
I was very impressed by the botanical gardens in Batumi. They were very beautiful. They were a little more extensive than I initially imagined. The views were beautiful. You could see along the coastline because we were right off of the sea. It was quite an incline. I wasn't quite expecting that either. It was quite a trek to get up and around, but it was very impressive. I was impressed by the different sections. There was, I don't know, a little bit more to it than I might have initially imagined, and it was just overall really beautiful. I loved how we kind of crested the hill. We got to see out over, everybody took a whole bunch of pictures. It was beautiful, and then we got to go all the way down and made it to the beach and got to see, looking up at the gardens and seeing a different angle, and just getting to take in how beautiful it was. We went to this restaurant for lunch where there was like a trout farm, so everybody was catching trout, and then I got to walk along the side of this like stream, and there were cows just there. We were kind of chasing the cows a little bit. We hopped rocks across the stream just back and forth, and it was just really beautiful and very serene, and it was very cool getting to watch them cook and grill the like trout that people had caught, and getting to enjoy just, you know, traditional Georgian food, which is great and all. So it was a very beautiful and very fun afternoon.
So I went to the Stalin Museum, and I can say that the most interesting thing about it was that it wasn't a memorial type museum. In fact, it seemed almost fond in the way it looked. There were flowers at the base of the Stalin statue. It wasn't really what I was expecting to go when I saw the Stalin Museum, but it was interesting nonetheless. And it was very personal in the way that they presented Stalin. So it was very interesting to see that, and I was glad to be able to be a part of seeing where Stalin came from and the home he came from, and seeing that, making that trip to go out to Gori to see where he came from. You know, he was such an important part of World War II. Honestly, I was pretty shocked, really, of how he was presented in the museum. There wasn't really commentary on what he did per se. It was more just they presented him as any other historical figure, which really he's kind of a controversial one in my mind. And I just thought it was a bit odd they, had such a public display for him and flowers at his feet in the museum, and they had a gift shop in there with Stalin's name on T-shirts and Stalin's picture. It was a little bit jarring because really, at least in the U.S. and I believe most of the rest of Europe and the West, he's viewed as someone that was in the ranks of someone like Hitler in terms of how many people he killed. But there's a gift shop dedicated to him in Georgia, so it was kind of jarring to see that.
So on Wednesday, when we were in Georgia, we went to Mesquite, which is a town about 20 minutes north of the main capital, Tbilisi, and it actually used to be was the capital of Georgia until recently. It's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, town in Georgia, and it's a really beautiful town marked by cobblestone streets, some traditional Georgian architecture, and surrounded by mountains in every direction. One of the places we went to was one of the monasteries in the town, which was built in the 11th century, very old building, and it was beautiful, just able to see how religion plays such a big part in Georgian culture, dating all the way back to when it first became a Christian empire. And we enjoyed walking through the streets and shopping and seeing all the Georgian culture in this beautiful town. I was really surprised by how religious Georgia is as a country, and it can really be exemplified by going to Mesquite, where they have this beautiful monastery. One of the things, women, when they come into the church, they cover their heads, and also it's not religiously appropriate to wear shorts into the church, so people dress very modestly in Georgia as a symbol of modesty before Christ. And another thing, the Georgian cross that we represented, it's a little bit different than the normal cross that are represented in a lot of different cultures. It has it's a bent cross representing Georgian Christianity, which is a very unique part of the symbol of their Christianity here.
So after the first visit to the academy, we drove to an internal border of the South Ossetia, with essentially it was a little house that had a museum on the first floor of the basement area, which essentially displayed images of and artifacts from the 2008 war with Russia, with Georgians fighting the Russians, and essentially it showed the impact that the Georgians that the Russians had on Georgia while they were fighting. So it kind of helped understand that how like strong Georgia and the Georgians, military and people are as a country. They're like one strong unit. And that single building was really cool because it's like an everyday house, and it was basically displayed how like every family was contributing to the war effort, and they essentially they'll never give in to the Russians.
So at Granio Fortress, we had a short guided tour around the inner courtyard where a majority of the remains were kind of grown over, not really kept up. They're cleaning it up a little bit to make it more presentable for tours. And then after that, we were allowed to go on the walls of the fortress, which was really neat. They were probably about 5 meters high. And then you get to walk around the remaining ramparts and look through and kind of imagine yourself back when this was made, first century, and it's been evolving with all the different conquerors that have gone through there. It was really neat to see. And then in the museum in the center, you found all these different artifacts. There was some trebuchet, a catapult, and a battering ram that you could see in this glass room. So those were really neat to see that they were really used and whatnot. And it was really cool in general. The fortress was made in the 1st century by the Romans, and then later became under the control of the Georgians and the Turks as well. And then when the Soviets conquered the lands, they just they planted citrus trees there, and now it's just used as a museum for people to go to.
So to start out, Georgian food is very, very delicious. So when we got here, we kind of looked at the menus and didn't really know what to get. So we asked our tour guides to actually order for us, and we had no idea what was coming. And it was kind of funny because they would bring out food and just more and more food, and we weren't really expecting it. And everything was delicious. So at every meal, it was kind of similar. When you would start out with a salad with cucumbers and tomatoes, and then you would get like cheese bread, then like bread with cheese and the cheesy mushrooms, and then like you would get your assorted meats. It would be like pork or beef and something like that. So another difference was that everybody kind of shared food. We thought we're used to like getting our own plates and just eating off our own plates, but everybody was just kind of giving each other food, and I mean it worked out well, and we ate a lot, and it was delicious. My favorite food was definitely the kebab. It was really good, and it came in like a pretty big portion. So
the experience was pretty incredible because this region is extremely important, but we didn't know a whole lot about it. Georgia, Ukraine, none of it. We just read about it in the news a little bit, but to experience the culture, hear about the political, socio-economical climate in these areas separately, there's nothing like it to go right to the region and hear from the people and the experts what's going on, and it's gonna stick with them for the rest of their lives and careers. The connections they made here, the information they learned here, they're not gonna get that anywhere else. That experience. So that's why it was extremely valuable that they came and saw and heard from these people, because it is extremely important in this region, and it does affect the United States and their future lives. Just the struggle that they're going through, that was that was the most interesting thing that I learned, this struggle that they're experiencing economically while also defending against Russia and trying to get into NATO. That watching the people and their lives and seeing that firsthand in Ukraine was equally impactful because we got to see from their vantage point the way they're handling the issue of Russia and their economic issues imposed on them by Russia and the partnership with the United States. That was really interesting, watching, looking at the differences between Georgia and Ukraine.
The drive to the wine region, Signagi, was a very beautiful drive. The scenery was amazing, and just wine in general in Georgia was such a big part of the history. It was really cool to see how they've been making wine for thousands of years in the traditional Kivari, and how the Georgian wine industry is growing and very popular in Europe. After the wine factory tour, we went to a restaurant that overlooked the Georgian countryside, had traditional Georgian food, and it was very, very delicious. Georgian wine compared to other wines was interesting because it was relatively dry, and it wasn't necessarily traditional white or red wine. It was kind of a color in between, almost golden, and just the process that goes into it gives it a really unique taste. Georgian wine is made underground in clay jars. It's fermented underground for up to 9 months to a year, and the process results in wine with very little sugar, and therefore it's a healthier wine overall. The Alizani Valley was very vast and very beautiful and offered a lot of amazing views of the Georgian countryside, and was really a good example of what the Georgian terrain looks like.